Okay, if we can resume, please. Okay, there are a few requests for people to make comments just before we have the break. So start with Mr. Jarman first, and then.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Mallet. Just to point out again that we've tried our best with deliverability, phase-in. There is a ring around mainly contacting planning agents for the sites, and this is the best evidence we've got. Secondly, Farley Hill, I've just been speaking to the agent. The landowner, Mr. Pat Burke, has cleared 95% of the site in terms of contamination. There is a potential of volume house builder interested. And just going back to a strategic point, I think, dare I say, there's a bit of a game here to try and lever more and more greenfield sites. But Farley Hill, in 2016, I accept that it wouldn't be in the top 5 for any housing company. But they've had a great choice. Clearly, housing companies and their representatives today, I think they're representing entirely greenfield sites. Clearly, they are more appetizing for housing companies. But as I keep saying, through the local plan, those sites have been allocated. They are being developed. I know Mr. Court wants to slow it down as much as possible, but they are being developed. So those alternatives are diminishing, and sites like Farley Hill will come back into the fray, and are coming back into the fray. Thank you.
Mr. Court.
Thank you, sir. I'll just try and go fairly quickly through a number of sites I've identified where I do have concerns about their deliverability within the time frame as shown by the Borough Council. First of all, I should say...
Just before you do that, we get on to other sites. Can I just take the other comments on previous discussion before we have that? Mr. Munton.
Thank you. I'm going to pick up on a few points that's sort of been made over the last half an hour, I suppose. I do just want to pick up on what Mr. Cooling said about it will be the council that will be held to account should this fear of the front-loading unravel. I don't think it will be the council ultimately. It will be house prices and it will be the locals that will suffer. And Mr. Cooling made reference to Guildford. Well, being a resident of Guildford and seeing the constraint on housing supply there and what that does to house prices, I think Maidstone should be fearful. I think it's also very unfair to say that developers want the plan to fail. I mean, I certainly don't want the plan to fail, but I do want it to be realistically deliverable. And I think, certainly from my own point of view, that's why I'm making the points I'm making about the delivery. Just a little bit of personal experience. Farley Hill, I've personally looked at that within the last 5 years. I note the potential developer is involved and 95% or whatever has been remediated, but this is a site that's been hanging around a long time, has a lot of problems, and yeah, having it within the 5 years supply, I think is a real concern. Laguna, again, I have looked at this site within the last 5 years. It does have flooding.
So which site, sorry?
Sorry, the Laguna site.
Laguna, yeah.
Yeah, flooding is an issue. I note what Mr. Jarman says about being above 6 metres and such like, probably car parking underneath, which has taken place a lot of Maidstone. But is that still correct today? Following, I mean, those developments have been built were built some years ago. As you know, we've got more strict tests on flooding. The other thing about Laguna is that, certainly from my dealings with the owner, is that he has quite a successful business there. And so it has an existing use value, which is quite hard to compete with. Coming on to the Staplehurst site in Mr. Bedford's, the Hen and Duckhurst. We went through about where it is now, and the delays in permission being issued, and how when we get onto site. The idea of the latest housing supply is to pick up all of those sort of points, to give confidence in delivering and in the plan. So, I have a concern. We've looked at one site there. It may be the only site. But if that site hasn't picked up, what other sites haven't been picked up, and what delays are there in those? Conditions being discharged, outlines not being determined yet, etc. I would have thought the purpose of this update is to capture that from the council's point of view themselves. I'm like Mr. Bedford, I'm struggling a bit. I wasn't aware of a further update to the housing topic paper. I was using the one that was published last week. So I haven't picked up on one.
I think last week's is the most recent, I think. Yeah, so there wasn't one more recent than last week.
There hasn't been one this week, which...
Well, I think it was it Friday? It was, I think, or...
I mean, the version I have, which was the latest version when I was looking at this on Friday, and there's other reasons to why I was only looking at it on Friday, still has Syngenta in. I didn't write down what new version it was, but putting that aside...
The one that was on the website on Friday, and so whether it had been updated on Friday, I'm not sure. The most recent one says November 2016 revision.
Yeah, I think there's two, both saying November.
Yes, the other one came together with the windfall and. The latest one is just a trajectory.
Yeah, the latest version was published on Friday when submissions had to be in.
Yes.
I must admit, I hadn't done any more work, not expecting there to be a further document. But putting that aside, I would just like to note that somewhere the council, between those two documents, has found in the order of 300 units in its 5-year supply. And I wasn't sure whether you'd closed, sort of moved on to site in Mr. Bedford's statement. But in terms of the Liverpool versus the Sedgefield methods, you talked about a potential Maidstone method. I personally can see no reason why the Sedgefield approach shouldn't be taken here. And I go back to where I was commenting on Mr. Cooling's points when I started. Thank you.
Can we just compare those two trajectories, that baseline figure? So Ms. Munson's saying that the supply has gone up, and try to understand why that is.
So, if I may, this is the inclusion of Lenham. Lenham coming into the first 5 years with its new trajectory, and also the revisions to Lodge Road and Staplehurst as a result of the neighbourhood plan being made.
So no, just if you look at the two trajectories, this is the early November one and the late November one, and I'll just go around on the summary page, the column on the right, see which figures have changed. So we've got the extant permissions the same, obviously. allocated sites down from 5,600 to 5,450. So that's the deduction of Syngenta and the addition of an allowance at Staplehurst, Lodge Road, Staplehurst. Is that the only changes? I think. Yeah. Okay. Broad locations have gone down. That's because it's that 1st of April.
This would be the old goods yard in Lenham, sir.
Yes. Yes, the old goods yard was a pre-1st of April decision, and Ham Lane was post-1st of April, isn't it? Yes. Okay, so the deduction from the... yeah, because so previously that wasn't allowed as part of the... that wasn't interpreted as part of the broad location. So there was an extant permission already, but the broad location has gone down. Windfall allowance the same. Total it's gone down from 16,465 to 16,250. Overall supply is down from 19,325 to 19,110. Right, so overall supply is down. So the 5-year supply then. In the Council's other documents. Now, that's gone up as a result of bringing forward Lenham, is it mainly? And Lodge Road, Staplehurst.
Syngenta's come out, so there's 40 units within the original 5-year supply for Syngenta, but as a result of the Lenham broad location rephase, and that's added the increase, and also the Lodge Road as well.
Okay. But then this comes to the issue of whether the broad location that's come into the 5-year supply, we've got these, that's Ham Lane and El Goods Yard, is it? In there. Well, yeah, I mean, El Goods Yard is already in the extant, so that should still be in extant, shouldn't it, rather than a broad location.
That's correct. The old goods yard is still in extant. So, yeah, Ham Lane makes up half of the broad location for Lenham. That's now in the 5 years, and then there's an 80 dwelling allowance in there as well.
Right. So that isn't. Yeah, it's just like the old situation. It's because it's broad locations shouldn't really be in the 5-year supply at the start of the period. And you've got a permission, but the permission was post 1st of April, so it's in your September figures, not in your April figures as a permission. Right. I think yes. I mean, if you're going on 1st of April dates, I don't think it ought to be in there. It should be. As of 1st of April, it should probably still be in the post-2021 allowance. But I mean, when you next update it, it would go into it would come back into the early period as an extant permission. Yeah. Yeah, so I don't think the 80 should be there, and the 1442 ought to be in the extant permission. So, although the broad locations, what else would it be? Yeah, I think as at 1st of April, I don't think you can treat it the way you have. I think just take out those board locations, that line of board locations, and if they're still in the extants, fine. But not other, shouldn't be included otherwise, I don't think. So the actions move the board location figures from the extent, from the 5-year supply. Okay. And if that's done, what happens here? So it's 18, 82. So that wouldn't, in your 5-year supply, that would knock back the 5-year supply, but that's something close to what we were before. Oh, yeah. Okay. Right. Ms. Cooling.
Thank you very much. Just to say that we believe the Maidstone Borough Council will be held to account, is being held to account, and it is slightly flippant, but we've probably all seen the Kent Messenger, the local paper, last Friday, where it is the members, as well as the officers, who will be challenged. And the residents, it's interesting, would the residents prefer to have the pain of constrained housing with adverse, from some people's perspective, on house prices, or would residents prefer to have many houses and this county town suffering even more from infrastructure issues? But it strikes me that this trajectory, this forward planning, is substantially an art form, given that it's over 15 years. We can try for greater precision in the immediate forward 5 years, and that's what a lot of this conversation has been about. But I think we need to remind ourselves that in the 5-year supply, there is a buffer against potential non-delivery of 321. And in terms of the overall objectively assessed housing need, plus the adjustment for affordable housing, there's something like a 500 buffer. We believe that number is far too big anyway, the overall number. So there is some buffering there to allow for errors, and there will be errors. But I think it's important that we heard from one court, we heard from one court earlier on, which is in fact is quite helpful, whether or not we should treat estate agents as experts in this subject or other subjects, shall we say, remains to be seen. But Mr. Court also referred to traffic issues, which the coordinating team is really, excuse the expression, banging on about, as is KCC. So there is a real issue here that this court has judged to be perhaps an absorption issue for this borough, and another court, an official court, may or may not agree. Absorption is an issue. We're being driven in the 5 years by the mechanism of 5 years housing supply. In this sense, it is a flawed concept, because it is trying to pick up for past so-called under-delivery, but that is under-delivery in terms of the latest requirement. And it is actually driving the borough to go for what sounds like a very unsustainable trajectory, unsustainable because of the impact on our borough in terms of its infrastructure. So unfortunately, the government has placed upon us and upon you, Mr. Inspector, adherence to a trajectory that must at least meet the objectively assessed housing need plus its adjustment. We don't agree with that number. And it's also layering on this 5 years housing supply in advance, and it will be in advance of the first time we will actually be able to review what has happened in Maidstone with all of the changes that are committed already. Is it 2022 with a review of the local plan? This 5 years mechanism is producing a pain which could be a dramatic pain for this borough and its residents. And if you've got any creative way, you've mentioned the Maidstone method. if there's any other creative way that this borough, through its officers and members, can legitimately put forward a plan which is sound in terms of trajectory and in terms of shorter-term requirements, which reduces this mad rush for a distorted trajectory which will cause incredible pain, then we please make a plea with you that you are as creative as you possibly can. Thank you.
Okay, I'll come to Mr. Court's sites in a moment, but I think first, before I do that, I want to deal with, because say time is running on, to deal with a bigger issue potentially, which is the Invicta Barracks site. We've got we know about the announcement of the Invicta Barracks scheduled to close in 2027, as a year later than the plan assumed. That leaves strictly 4 years to the end of the plan period for the delivery of that as a broad location. A number of people have also suggested that, I mean, firstly, there's a risk of the date slipping or changing, but also the chances of being able to commence delivery kind of immediately after that vacation of the site is somewhat doubtful. That even if you can do all your kind of master planning and the applications and everything, so that ready to start on the kind of the day the military move out, which has its own issues, then there's bound to be kind of site preparation works and things, and the first year is going to be slow anyway. So that maybe 6 months, a year or something before we actually start to get delivery from the date of vacation, all of which starts to make the delivery of the amount of housing proposed in the plan rather doubtful within the plan period. It's 1,300 houses, and if you've only got 4, maybe 3 years to do that, that doesn't sound to me very realistic. I'm not sure that necessarily is going to matter at this stage, because the national policy seeks, say, where possible, to identify broad locations for that period, and it doesn't necessarily say that you have to meet the housing supply for the full plan period if you're going to review the plan in the interim. And if there is, the broad location, you'd need to move forward to allocations at some point anyway, which say you can do the 2022 review stage. And if then, as it seems there's an opportunity then that you could bring forward, seek other allocations, if necessary, to make up that supply, which could be brought forward at an earlier date. And that may be the way to deal with that issue. Any comments on that? Ms. Stevens first.
Yes, so you're essentially saying that even though it's a strategic allocation, it's something that we can effectively deal through a review of the plan. And yeah, possibly, except this council doesn't have a particularly good track record in producing an up-to-date plan. Mm-hmm. So that's why I think the council's probably forfeited that as an option at this stage. The NPPF does actually really require local authorities to demonstrate that they can deliver their housing requirements over the plan period. And this particular location is responsible for a sizable component of that overall requirement. 4 years, really, we've got left to deliver 1,300 homes. That would, assuming you've got all your ducks in the row to start work immediately in 2027, you'd be having to get 325 dwellings per annum. Even if you had 4 developers on board, so you have 4 outlets, you're looking at about 81 units per outlet per annum. That is just well in excess of what the historic average build-out rate is per outlet, per site, per year. Currently, that historic average, and it's a national historic average, so it isn't necessarily a guide, but it gives you a rough guide. The historic national average is 25 units per outlet, per site, per year. And it varies according to market area, so stronger areas of the market can sustain higher rates. So it just isn't feasible. I think any planner, any professional planner will know that this site is not going to deliver in this plan period. It'll be an important site for the next plan, but not for this plan. Added to that, sir, is that the council at the moment has a lamentable record in actually determining planning applications, discharging conditions and agreeing Section 106 mechanisms. I had a meeting with the members yesterday. They are particularly concerned about Maidstone's performance in this regard. There are 3 developers who've had to wait over a year for the agreement of Section 106 obligations. So it's even were you ready to start, you had a planning permission in 2027, very unlikely. You're looking for at least a couple of years, at least another year, a couple of years delay. 3 years, realistically, before you'd be ready to start on site. I think, as I said, any professional planner would know that this is a non-starter.
Okay. Ms. Cooling?
I'm afraid I must totally disagree, and unfortunately, I have to totally plead on behalf of Maidstone Borough Council for this for the next minute or two, so which is a slight exception. I would be the first to agree that the time taken by Maidstone Borough Council to get to this stage is lamentable. I totally agree. Having said that, we have to make some allowance for MPPF, but I also think there's been a degree of, and I'll use the word, greed on the part of ruling regimes within the borough to take advantage of the new homes bonus to go in for a P&L or balance sheet repair. And as an aside, this coordination team has already decided it's going to continue its existence beyond whatever this plan turns out to be, because we fundamentally believe at the moment we do not want to be 5 years from now with a plan review with the same word being used by the two of us, a lamentable performance. It is not acceptable. And as an aside, I've lost track of this week already, but I think it was Monday evening, I was at one of the committee meetings of members plus 2 parish council representatives, of which I am one. And it was looking at the risk profile, the risks of the borough. And there were, to be fair to the borough, it was generally sound or strong. There were a few exceptions which were weak, and Section 106 processes was one of the weaknesses. And that may well be because I haven't got a clue, staff changeover, regime changeover, I haven't got a clue. So that has been recognised by the borough. And though I'm not a great defender of the borough, I would like to believe that the chief executive will move to heal over that weakness. And so we, the coordinating team, very much view 2022, and not to start this review of the local plan, but it should be completed by then, if not far earlier, given everything that's going on. We will be working to keep the borough to account for its timescale, so that there cannot be 2 of us, heaven forbid, in 5 years' time saying there's been, or 10 years' time saying again there has been a lamentable performance. It is lamentable and it cannot persist. This borough is, by the sound of it, going to depend upon a very serious and professional review of this local plan well within 5 years. Thank you.
Mr. Chairman. Ms. Edgerton.
Thank you, sir. Some very interesting comments from the other side of the room. Obviously, we are committed, and we have stated in writing that we are committed to a review by 2022 of our local plan. I see no reason why we shouldn't do that. I was a bit concerned about the sort of negative, pessimistic view, once again, that we've heard all morning from the development industry. And in particular, the view that any professional planner would know that this is a non-starter. Well, Louise Spalding MRTPI, works for the Defence Infrastructure Organisation and has been in regular communications with us, sir. Latest communication states the following. DIO can confirm that 2027 is an estimated date for the disposal of Invicta Park Barracks. There is potential for the barracks to be released earlier, and DIO is working on ways to speed up the release. DIO will continue to work with the Council to bring forward the release date. So it seems, sir, that actually we are on course to bring this forward before 2027, and they will be undertaking, in addition to this commitment, which they have asked me to pass on to you, sir, annual reviews, in addition to the informal discussions which are taking place as we speak.
Mr. Sharman?
Yeah, specifically on Section 106 agreements. I do recognise it is still a problem. I've done a number of things. New Section 106s over the last 2 months are going out to external firms as solicitors. But also, what we have done is produce templates which have gone onto the website so that planning consultants, when they submit their planning applications, there is a draft Section 106, rather than application goes to planning committee agree, and there's a big discussion about heads for the Section 106, and then months and months go by in terms of actually getting the Section 106 signed. So my disappointment and challenge to Mr. Stevens is, what positive role are you playing rather than just complaining? I don't see any draft Section 106s. You'll be familiar with unilateral undertakings. Unfortunately, they don't come forward. You seem to want your cake and eat it. Also, in my experience of negotiating Section 106s, you have to work with, dare I say it, your solicitors. So there's to and fro in. So I think it's very disproportionate to put it all at the door of the Borough Council. And in case, again, Mr. Stevens, your end game is to slow development down so you get more of the greenfield sites that you like.
Mr. Stevens.
Yeah, just on the heads of terms, I have heard this, and this was reported to me by one developer at my meeting yesterday, and they did actually use your standard template, and it was rejected by the officer in question in the council, who said that it wasn't for the developer to put forward standard heads of terms. It's a kind of secondary matter, but it is a problem at the moment with delivery. It's acting as a major block on delivery, and I think it relates to some of the discussions we've had about the 5-year land supply and some of the expectations about when those sites will actually get implementable planning permissions. The experience of my members is that it is very difficult with Maidstone at the moment in terms of development management. In terms of the letter from, I think it was Louise Spalding, MRTPI, employed by the MOD estates, it's a hope that it might come forward before 2027. The evidence that we have before us for this examination is that we don't know. It might appear at 2027. We have to plan on the basis of probabilities and reasonable certainties. And I think a statement to the effect that it might be released or it might not, I just don't think is sufficient, is really sufficiently robust for what is quite an important component of the housing land supply.
Mr. Evans.
Thank you, sir. I think I'd echo the comments made by Mr. Stevens. We are in a business here of looking at what evidence is before us to make it, or what's evidence before you to make a determination on what is appropriate. Now, we're told that the Invicta Barracks will come forward in 2027, possibly a year before if everything goes to plan. But those delivery rates are still, in my mind, utterly unrealistic in that period of time. I've recently been in down at the Canterbury examination, where we've been discussing a site for 4,000 units with a delivery rate of 300 units per annum, which in itself was unrealistic. I'm aware of 3 reports which look at delivery rates across the country. One was produced for Gladman by Hurrigan Connolly, one was produced by Savills, and one has recently been published by NLP. I don't think any rates in those reports would get anywhere near what the council is claiming for Invicta Barracks. And what is frustrating for this side of the table, I think, is we are trying to put forward what our opinion is on the delivery rates of sites. Now, I appreciate the council have a different opinion on what those delivery rates would be, but what we need to do, if we want to get an adopted plan in place, is come to a sound conclusion on what those delivery rates are, what is reasonable in assessing those rates, because if we don't, the first time a planning application comes to appeal, the 5-year land supply for this plan will be found to be non-existent. So it's important we have a realistic and important debate on this subject at this examination, but that's what the PPG tells us to do.
Yeah, I mean, the Invicta won't affect the 5-year supply as yet, because it's at the end of the plan period, whatever. But the council, the council to say what delivery rate they expect and how do they justify that rate.
Yes, thank you very much. So we actually have as sub 005 a letter attached from the MOD explaining that they will be able to deliver within the planned period. So that is Appendix E, page 63 of that document, which we have then interpreted. Starting with 200 in the first year, which is the 2026-27 year, and then moving to standard 275 units per annum in the following years.
Obviously, that would be based on more than one house builder building on the site.
I mean, okay, even if those rates are achieved, you're going to lose the first year, because if it's not released till 2027, so that which would suggest you'd lose 200 off the allocation, even if you can achieve that in subsequent years.
Well, our negotiations, and I'll provide you with this, indicate that DIO are actually working to pre-2027.
Well, yes, but the official announcement you can't really rely on that. If they've only just this announced as 2027, to immediately say that it's going to be earlier, I think that's not a very reliable figure. In fact, I just think yes, you don't. If it starts a year later, you actually don't lose 200, you lose 275, because it's the latest one that drops off the periods, because you're building last ones in 31, 32. Which kind of suggests that, in any case, even on your rates, you're really talking about somewhere in the region of 1,000 rather than 1,300 or 1,025. But also on that, in fact, it isn't just a case of more than one builder. I don't think we've got any sites in the plan where you're suggesting more than 85 per dwellings per site per year. I think that Sutton Road is your estimate of the highest delivery from one site. And so, even if it's split into kind of 3 sites, you need to split it into at least 3 sites, even to get your highest rate. And if you don't get highest rate, if you only get, say, 50 per year, per builder, it could be rather less than that. Mr. Munson, you wanted to comment?
Thank you. I think you sort of made some of the points for me. I mean, the evidence we have before us is the announcement earlier this month, the Better Defence Estates announcement, which refers to 2027. I think anything else could just be only considered wishful thinking. The idea of developing 200 units in the first year is in my mind, fairly farcical. No matter how many developers you have on the site, year 1, this site has to be cleared. Year 2, you start developing, and it's only at the end of that year, potentially the year after, that you're going to start to see your first houses available for purchase. So, at best, I think you've got a 2-year lead in. And then, like I say, the idea of developing 200 in the first year, I just cannot see. I have no experience of it anywhere else in the country. And like you also say, there is no other site within this plan that is proposing more than 85 a year. A second point that very important to Invicta Barracks, it builds on what Mr. Bedford said earlier, where he, like ourselves, has a concern over, the town centre and the windfalls. There's a potential unknown of about 2,500 there. Depending on what number you put in, we've now got the barracks on top of that. So we've now got windfalls and 2 of the broad locations with question marks over them. That amounts to, if you total all of those, 3,890 in the plan. Almost 4,000 units are not known currently.
Okay. Ms. Stevens?
I just wanted to, one of the things I forgot to mention is I just wanted to counter the suggestion that I've been very negative. I think I have been very positive about many aspects of the plan, including the trajectory, the adoption of the Sedgefield approach by the Council. I think the spread of sites, the portfolio of sites, as I said earlier, I think is a positive, reliable approach. And I think the windfall allowance is generally quite good. I also think the objectively assessed need figure is quite positive, albeit I have concerns about not factoring in the London migration, but it's better than many other plans I've seen. So I do think there are many good aspects to this plan. And I also haven't really challenged the Council's assumption that larger sites will tend to deliver at a rate of about 50 dwellings per annum, which is in their latest statement in paragraph 11. Some house builders and in some parts of the country, I would probably challenge that. But I think 50 for the larger sites is okay. But I think I just think the expectations about Invicta are just too unrealistic. The NPPF requires local plans to be aspirational, but realistic. And I think the assumptions about Invicta Barracks just go into the area of lacking any realism.
Mr. Bedford.
So just a quick point. Setting aside when development may come forward at Invicta Barracks, I think possibly the best example to look at as a similar case is Kings Hill, the former aerodrome. And I think if you look at the average completion rates there with multiple developers, similar characteristics and what have you, and that's about 150 a year. So my guidance would be, in the absence of any more solid evidence, that's about the right sort of rate that you would expect.
Is that how many developers would that be?
There must be 4 or 5, I would have thought. It's a phased development, so different developers are coming in at different times, but my estimate would be there are probably 4 or 5 working at any
Well,
one time.
sorry, 4 or 5 at once or 4 or 5 consecutively?
At any one time, yeah. I think it's a very, very good example to look at.
Okay, Ms. Cooling.
A detail following on that, Kings Hill, by the way, it might be interesting to look at the size, quality of the houses, etc., to explain part of that. But my main point was going to be...
Because you're suggesting that they're larger and more...
that is my view.
Yeah.
That is my view. Oh. My main point was going to be that somehow the development industry, and maybe it is not unified, because obviously there's a huge competition within it, somehow, according to this trajectory, it's going to be delivering 1,510 in the peak year. That means that the subcontractors, the materials producers, etc., have somehow been organised to produce that number. So when it gets to the back end of the plan, and by the way, MBC has got an impossible task on this plan. Precision does not work 10 years out. But the figures as they stand, towards the end of the plan, we're going to have a lot of people having to move to other parts of the country to do the physical work on building, etc., because the building rate, I can only do it by inspection at the moment, comes right down to about 750. So there is industry capacity. If competition with the industry is preventing what Maidstone needs, then the industry needs to do something about it. But this side of the table is negative, but everyone apart from myself is going for wanting windfalls down, is wanting a lower rollout, and why, and I think I heard Mr. Joyerman give a pretty darn good reason. For me, the negatives are about, the objective assessed housing needs far too high and the windfalls are far too low, but I'm a very worn record. But in our negatives, we're trying to help the borough, because if the pressure's reduced, the trajectory gets better, the 5 years housing supply is achievable. So I just do not agree with what I'm hearing on this side of the table. That is the delivery capability of the industry, even if it isn't organised competitively to deliver that. Thank you.
Just looking at how that delivery is made up in the last years of the plan period, I mean, there's virtually, the last 2 years, there's nothing from allocated sites at all, and the previous few years it's tailing off rapidly. So we've got, early in the plan period, we've got allocated sites delivering up to 850 per year, but then it falls to 385, 205, 105, and then nothing for the last 2 years, the plan becomes very heavily reliant on the broad locations and this increased windfall allowance in those last few years, which comes back to another point Mr. Stevens making about diverse sources of supply. And I think my conclusion from this essentially is that it would be prudent to reduce the expectation of how much will come from particularly the Invicta allocation in those last 3 to 4 years of the plan. But there isn't an urgency, I don't think, now about replacing that, because you've got so much supply coming forward in the early years of the plan. It isn't. I don't think it doesn't seem to be the case that the plan should be paused because we urgently need to get some other sites into the stream now. But it does. My view is really that it should be flagged up that one of the matters for the review by 2022 will be identifying allocations for that later part of the plan period. To go alongside the broad location delivery, and because you're not going to just need delivery in Lenham and Central Maidstone in those years anyway. It's going to need to be spread out more across the town and the borough as a whole. But it doesn't. There isn't. I don't think there is that urgency now of allocating sites for that period. You don't need it now for the 5-year housing supply immediately to replace that. but I think much more realistic delivery rates for Invicta is going to be somewhere around the 150 per annum mark at the stage. So 150 for well, and probably less in the first year. So say you can say if it's 50 in the first year, then 150 for 3 years. You're talking about 500 dwellings instead of 1,300, and that would mean 800 to be found from other sources at the review stage.
Yes, I'd agree with that. The only slight disagreement is that I don't think there will be that much of a delay in starting to build out the houses, because I think it's a great site in terms of off-site infrastructure. It's very close to Junction 6. As you know, there's a very large roundabout outside of it. So I don't think there's... I agree with Mr Bedford in terms of Kings Hill is a good example of very long-phased development, but I totally disagree with him in terms of infrastructure, because being an airfield, basically the infrastructure has had to have followed the housing. I live just outside Kings Hill, and the local residents have sort of complained, including myself actually, it's the other way around. The infrastructure is following the housing.
Mr Munton?
Thank you. Just 2 points in terms of Kings Hill. Mr Cooling, I think, was making reference to the mix there. Certainly the 2 parcels that I was involved in developing on Kings Hill had a very good mix, from 1 and 2 bedroom apartments to 4 and 5 bedroom houses. You were sort of, I think you were just alluding to a potential 4-year supply. From Invicta Barracks. I mean, looking at it from a dead start in 2027, which is all we can assume, I personally still feel as though potentially 50 could be developed in the year 28-29, and then potentially 150 for the following 2 years, looking at this plan. I just don't see those units coming out as quickly as a year after 2027. Thank you.
Ms Bedford?
Thank you. Just a quick point on Kings Hill. Sorry, my 154 a year average delivery rate was from 2006 to 2015, so that's long after the key infrastructure has been put in. So it's once the site has all been prepped and ready to go, it's a good indication. I say it's not definitive, but I think it's probably as good an example as we're going to get in the surrounding area. So again, it's to help rather than hold you to anything. So just make that point. I think my biggest issue with the plan as a whole is this lack of flexibility and what happens if certain parts don't come through as we hoped. It applies for the windfall allowance, it applies for the broad locations, it applies for delivery of Invicta Barracks. And paragraph 14 of the NPPF is very clear that local plans should meet the full objectively assessed need with sufficient flexibility to rapidly respond to change. And I think that's where I'm particularly concerned, is everything is so tight at the moment. We've looked at the new trajectory, and I think we're about 300 units in credit, depending on whether or not you apply a 5 or 20% buffer. But it is very tight. There's no slack in the system for a rapid change in circumstances. I think that's critically where the benefit of identifying further sites now will provide the plan with the flexibility that will see it up to 2022, or at such a time that you can do a proper review. What we wouldn't want to do is go too speculative on the plan now and find that the whole time the new plan is being reviewed and being put in place, that it's speculative development as it has been for the llast 5 years or so.
But with extra sites, I mean, they only provide flexibility if there's some kind of way of holding in reserve or something like that. If you simply just allocate them, you don't just have flexibility, you just have more supply. You know,
well, again, we've advocated having a reserve site. We've said there should be something that has a very clear trigger that can come forward quickly if needed to remedy it. So it's a planned response to difficulties. It's integral. It's to provide the flexibility.
Okay. And we are going to over time. So quick from Mr. Jarman. I just want to have another quick look at Lenham delivery rate again, and then.
Yeah, just a very quick response to what Mr. Bedford said. He keeps using this term flexibility, which seems popular amongst the house builders. I presume what you're really saying, Mr. Bedford, is you just want more greenfield sites, which you presumably your clients have options on. So just the supply, in response to Mr. Cooling, just keeps going up, particularly on greenfield sites. But just a very specific point on Invicta Barracks. I might have got it wrong, but I'd interpreted, and it's a very small point, I'd interpreted 2027 as being 1st of January 2027 rather than the 1st of April. Not a massive difference.
Well, yeah, because we don't actually know that, because they haven't given a date. All right, okay. Because I mean, usually, but especially if you're a politician making an announcement, you wouldn't be expected to choose 2027 if it's going to be the 1st of January. I think you say it's going to be 2026 and say, oh, it's the 1st of January. Doesn't matter. That's it.
I'm used to people specifying what it is.
Yeah. I thought mid-year would be a more likely average. Yes, Ms. Cooling.
A very quick one. If my colleague, Dr. Rebecca Driver, were here, and by the way, it isn't in the Haycorn neighbourhood plan, no doubt, but she'd been actually saying that there is an adjustment, an unwarranted adjustment, to the raw, objectively assessed housing need that has been made for affordable homes. She says it's not justified.
The market signals, think the argument, yes. I'm aware of the argument, yeah.
Forgive me. And it's about, from recollection, 15, 16, 1700. So that is, if Dr. Rebecca...
I think it's 5%, wasn't it? I think it's 900, I think.
Forgive me. Yeah. Memory's failing. But there's a sizable element there that if Dr. Driver's argument is accepted, which we subscribe to, then there's another element of flexibility if 18560 is carried forward.
Okay. Yeah. Just we've discussed Lenham several times, but just want to a final word on the supply from there. Obviously, we had the original situation similar to Invicta, in which there's a conclusion that it was an unrealistic delivery rate from that site, again in the same period. And here, because you don't have to wait until the site's vacated as in Invicta, then the council has proposed an alternative, which is to bring forward that to the previous plan period, so it would be from 2021, and also include these sites, which in fact can be delivered earlier. These two appeal sites, and counted against that allowance. Although I think a simpler way to deal with those sites is not to say they're actually broad location sites, but just reduce the broad location figure. I mean, that makes it more straightforward, because broad locations you're normally saying, well, this is for some period ahead, and then we're going to have allocations and so on. But you've already got permissions, so I think it's simpler to just take them off the total and deal with them separately. Now that leaves the delivery rate now, I think, assumed you've got 1350 houses then or dwellings to deliver over a 10-year period if it starts in 2021. So that's 135 per year. There was a figure talked about earlier about 120 a year, but it seems if you're not including those in the first 5-year period, then after that, I mean 1350 is 135 per year. And just seek some comments on that as delivery rate. I mean, potentially, if the council's proposals follow through and we don't get a different scheme coming forward to the neighbourhood plan, and the council looking at essentially kind of three areas for developments near east, west, south, which would kind of suggest at least 3 developers. Obviously, clearly, one of those could be Countryside, and they gave evidence at the earlier session about their site to the west. And of course, there's another alternative site to the west as well as their land, which is on adjacent land south of Ham Lane, which is been proposed by another developer. So you potentially got at least two developers to the west of Lenham. Does anyone have any other views about the realism of a 135 per annum delivery rate between 2021 and 2031? Mr. Jarman.
Yeah, just to say that what we are advocating as the first stage is a master plan. As you said, Mr. Mellor, to work out precisely where the housing sites would go, the open space, and other infrastructure, and build that into some kind of phasing. But it might be the case when we're producing the master plan, engaging with the likes of Southern Water, for instance, that actually the delivery comes forward. Because it might be the opposite, but Southern Water might be able to say, yes, we can accept 300 houses, just for argument's sake, before 2020. But we need to have those more detailed discussions through the master plan process. So we're not saying, at this point in time, the 2020-21 is our best estimate, and obviously master plans, be it a development plan document or the neighbourhood plan, in themselves take time as well.
Okay. Mr. Court, you've got clients in Lenham.
Thank you, sir. Yes, my clients, I act for the clients who have the land south of the railway at Lenham. First of all, I must say I welcome the Borough Council's acceptance that resisting development at the broad location until 2026 was, I think, quite ridiculous, and the fact they brought it forward to 2021 is certainly welcomed. I know that my clients would be pleased to engage with them. We've had difficulties with that in the past. I think the bringing forward of the start date for development at the broad location has been forced upon the council to a certain extent due to the problems that have been identified by clients regarding a number of sites that constitute the overall provision, and the fact that the council doesn't have a 5-year supply. I don't know if you're aware of it, sir, but there was the 4th Inspector's report issued last Friday that said Maidstone doesn't have a 5-year supply. So it has been pushed on them, but I'm very heartened to hear Mr. Jarman say that he is now going to proceed with a master plan, that delivery could come forward. And this is to let you know that my clients would love to meet the Borough Council, but we've found it very difficult because the council has set itself against any development south of the railway, and it has just refused my client's second application there. But that's one thing we'll be talking about, I think, next week. So rather than being negative, I welcome the Borough Council's change of heart and wish to put it on the record. I will speak to anybody from the Borough Council at any time. And of course, by elongating the period over which housing can be provided at Lenham, then the average annual provision rate, sales rate, will reduce to something that is realistic. Because 1,500 houses in 5 years at Lenham was utter nonsense. I would suggest that there is no bar on bringing these sites forward immediately, and indeed Mr. Jarman has just alluded to that. So I see the delivery of these houses at Lenham being a real possibility, thanks to the Borough Council's acceptance that resisting development there to the last 5 years is ridiculous. So they are certainly moving in the right direction.
I mean, of course, there is potentially early supply at Lenham anyway, because of the council's proposed allocation at Tanyard Farm and the two sites which have been on appeal. There is some existing supply. I just wonder, because earlier you're saying that villages of comparable size, Heghorn and Marden, you were suggesting you could only sell 50 or 60 dwellings a year. I mean, those allocations would provide that for the first 5 years in any case. Is that how many dwellings a year do you think Lenham could support after that date?
I think it's really dependent on the number of outlets. You're right, there's Tanyard Farm there. You're correct, there's Jones Homes won an appeal quite recently. I know that Wealdon are at appeal on their site as well. We've heard that Countryside have got development there. It really depends on getting the number of outlets going. I think, as I said, I thought 1,500 spread over 5 years was just totally ridiculous. I welcome the move to bring that back for a 10-year period, but I think they should start now. Literally, lift the embargo now. That would certainly help my clients appeal, and hopefully, if we can start building at Lenham from literally this year, then that will spread it out to pretty well 15 years. So I think that brings it down to a lot more acceptable figure. Even at that, it may well spread beyond the planned period, and I think this is what Maidstone were hoping for by shoving everything into the last 5 years. By bringing it forward, by permitting development now, they could certainly ease the self-inflicted wound of a lack of a 5-year supply, and I think they could send a message to the development industry that they were prepared to work with them and try to do their best to provide housing where it is needed with the requisite infrastructure. So it seems as though they're going in the right direction.
Can I ask the council what is this recent inspector's decision? You say there's another decision.
I think it's Warm Lake Crossroads, Sutton Valence, where the inspector, we can give you a copy. The inspector, as Mr. Court said, opined that we hadn't demonstrated that we had a deliverable supply of housing sites for 5 years. He did say that the 5% buffer was realistic, and he also dismissed the appeal.
Okay. Ms. Bedford?
So, yeah, I'd just like to echo Mr. Court, really, that we've still not seen any firm evidence or any genuine planning justification for not bringing forward sites in Lenham immediately. It's very easy to sit here and criticise this side of the table saying we want more greenfield land in. Well, we're actually just trying to help the council with their strategy and saying that we're not asking them to bring forward land that's not already relied upon in their numbers. We're just asking them to put a cohesive strategy in place so that it comes forward in a planned way. Now, in that respect, it's important to stress that we are here doing things the right way, promoting it through the plan-led system, and we're not one of the developers that are trying to get ahead of the game by putting in an appeal. So it is disappointing that there is quite so much mudslinging. Just on that point as well, as a company, DHA, I think nobody would be better placed if the plan was to fail or the plan was to not deliver in the numbers that it proposes to. So the fact that we're here trying to help, I take exception to the fact that we're purely hired guns and just trying to get extra greenfield land. There is a desire to see a robust, sound plan put in place for Maidstone so that we all know where we're going moving forward. Thank you.
Ms. Cooling?
We also want to see a sound plan, our reservations, but I think the point we'd like to make is if there's no need to accelerate or pull forward sites, we would really like to see them delayed, because we do not wish to see this spike forming or growing anymore, which will present us a huge problem with population statistics, etc., 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 that will underpin the review of the local plan. So no acceleration if it's not needed.
Mr. Chairman?
Yeah, I think Mr. Court understands where we're coming from on Lenham. Clearly, I don't want to see piecemeal development and master plans, neighbourhood plans or DPDs take a certain amount of time. So that's one point. But I'm not using that as an excuse to have an embargo on development outside of the allocations in Lenham before 2020, 2021. The other uncertainty is over the infrastructure providers like KCC, Education, like Southern Water, just not firming up whether or not there's any thresholds at all in Lenham, and if there are, what are they, and do KCC want at least one two-form entry school, a single one-form entry school and expand to Harwich? We just don't know. But going back to your point, sir, with the detailed allocation at Tanyard Farm, we've either just got an actual planning application or we will get one in the next few days. And obviously we consult people like KCC Education, Southern Water, etc., etc. And with the detail from the consultation, we may well be in a clearer position about when we release additional sites in and around Lenham.
Okay. Right, I'm going to have to draw this to a close in a moment. Mr. Court, your sites that you wanted to query, first of all, could you just give me a list of what the sites are, and then we'll see how we deal with them?
Certainly, sir. The first one is H14 Oakapple Lane, Barming. Okay. Yep. The second one is Kent House, Romney Place, which was a prior notification development that I think will have expired by the time the council think it's going to be built. Also, Brenchley House, another PN permission. I've done that one. I do have some general concerns about the volume of development at Springfield Park, but it is simply to say that and no more. There seems to be an awful lot of housing coming out of there. We've done south of Sutton Road. I'm concerned about the New Line Learning Academy at Maidstone, which is down for 180 units, but unless I'm corrected by anyone else, I understand the owners, Kent County Council, don't want it allocated. So if the owners don't want it allocated, then why is it down within the 5 years?
I think we're actually facing both ways on this at the moment, actually, because I asked for a corporate view and they gave me a highways view. So.
I'm happy to leave it at that. So it was just those few. If you want me to make any submissions in writing, I will, but I'm simply happy to say I have concerns about those. I would quickly add that Oakapple Lane, I think, should slip by 1 year. I do know something about that, sir. I'm the agent for the owner, and I haven't been consulted recently. Right. There were proposals to get it. Well, the planning application hasn't been submitted against expectations. That's all I'll say on that one.
And the two prior notifications, these are ones where there has been prior approval, but you don't think they're going to go ahead, is that the?
Well, the date when the council think they're going to go ahead will be out with the period of the prior notification. Basically, they are 1960s office blocks that have been in Maidstone for quite some time. Everybody's known about them. I'm just wondering whether they were effectively a valuation exercise by the developer. But just looking at my notes on Kent House, Permission was granted for 137 flats. It was required to be developed, for the development to be completed by the 30th of May 2016 under the PN permission.
And Brenchley House was 183 units, and you said that I think the note in the council's paper says it was a valuation exercise, and the owner's intention may have changed. Is that?
Yeah, as of the 1st of April, there was initial prior notification on Brenchley House for about 89 dwellings, and that was for a valuation exercise. Feedback from the agent was that, based on that initial prior notification, the applicant resubmitted and went up to 183, and currently the intentions of the site owner is unknown. So it's, yeah. Mm-hmm. So in terms of phasing purposes, we would have moved it from considering it as pure valuation to possibility for delivery.
So is that the 5-year supply or not?
It's in the 5-year supply, yes.
Mm-hmm. That's 183.
Well, as of the 1st of April base date, no, it's at the original prior notification. The 183 came in post 1st of April.
Okay. So 89. So 89 originally, you say? Okay, I think we'll have to leave that at that moment. Ms. Court, if you wanted to just put a note in on the reasons on each of those sites, then that would be helpful. Okay, right. I'm going to draw this session then to a close. We've got another session due to start at 2 o'clock, but we'll postpone that until 2:15. So it's 2:15 will start on the infrastructure session, which is carried over from the session 12. Okay, thanks very much for coming, Ray.